There were over 200 Revolutionary War battles in South Carolina, more so than any state in the Union. When you travel down the 85 corridor from North Carolina to Georgia, within 25 miles of the interstate on each side, there are 100 Revolutionary War battlefields. No place in America can make that claim. And of the 46 counties in South Carolina, there's only one county that has no Revolutionary War fort or battlefield. And I hate to say it, but that county is Anderson. That does not mean that Anderson County does not have a rich Revolutionary War history. Now, this was Cherokee territory during that time. And this area was heavily settled first by Revolutionary War veterans. Anderson County and city is named after a Revolutionary War hero, Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was Andrew Pickens' right-hand man throughout the Revolution. They were childhood friends in Virginia. They moved together to the Waxhaws area on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. Andrew Pickens was a true pioneer. He moved 4 times in the state of South Carolina, and 3 of those 4 times Robert Anderson moved with him, and they, in many cases, had adjoining properties. And they are buried both at the Old Stone Church within about 50 yards of each other. And I find it being perfectly fitting that Anderson County and Pickens County are next to each other as well. The Cherokees had a very definite role in the backcountry of South Carolina with the Revolutionary War. This is artist's conception of dragging canoe. Now, dragging canoe was a leading man of the Cherokees. Dragging canoe opposed every treaty that the Cherokees ever signed. At the time of the Revolutionary War, there were 16,000 Cherokees and there were 6,000 warriors. So both the Patriots and the Loyalists wanted to placate the Cherokees and fight with them when the war began. The Cherokee culture and the European culture were so absolutely opposite of each other. These two cultures could not understand each other. And that misunderstanding had absolutely deadly consequences, and it's tragic. So this is the Cherokee Path, and is the watershed between the Savannah River and the Santee River. The Cherokee Path does not cross any major rivers. We know this today as Highway 76, so we are using the Cherokee Path. So here is the area that the English controlled, and you can see that it was defined by the Continental Divide. And in 1763, the British made a decree that there would be no English settlement beyond the Continental Divide. And the Native Americans really liked that. The British were threatened by French interest. Since George Washington, 22 years old, wet behind the ears, inexperienced, he was given the role of managing the rear guard. And he was protecting the horses of the expedition. Well, when the French attacked and Braddock's men were defeated, they just started flooding through the rear guard lines. George Washington held that line and was able to, save the men who were defeated so bad. However, 4 years later, in 1758, there was an attack on Fort Duquesne. In the vanguard of this attack was Richard Paris. Richard Paris was the original settler in Greenville County. He set up a plantation on the Reedy River at the falls and the Liberty Bridge. That is where Richard Paris's plantation was. And he led 300 Cherokee warriors in the vanguard of the force that was attacking Fort Duquesne, and he reached the high ground. And when the defenders of Fort Duquesne saw the Cherokees on the high ground here, they knew the gig was up. They jumped in their boats and they sailed away down the Ohio River. And they abandoned Fort Duquesne, and Richard Paris and these Cherokees were the first to enter that fort. That's how strong the Cherokees were as allies to the British during this period. At some point along this journey, as they were coming back home, 30 of the Cherokee horses were stolen. And the Cherokees went to the settlers in Virginia and said, "Our horses got stolen." "Who stole our horses?" They're like, "We don't know who stole your horses." It's like, what clan did the people belong to that stole our horses? Now remember, the clan of the Cherokees has the right to seek retribution against the clan of whoever it was that stole those horses. By Cherokee tribal law, they had every right to take 30 horses from the North Carolinians as they were traveling back home. Well, if there's one thing the North Carolinians don't like, that's horse thieves. So a battle occurred, and it was a shooting gun battle the whole way back into the Cherokee territory. And about 25 North Carolinians were killed. And the governors of North Carolina and South Carolina embargoed the Cherokees. They refused to trade with them. They refused to give them shot and powder for their winter hunt. That was the condition of the Treaty of Saluda, that every fall the Cherokees would get shot and powder so they could hunt, shoot deer, skin the deer, sell the deer skins to the Charlestonians, and that was how the trade went back and forth. 25 of the leading men of the Cherokees went down to Charleston under a white flag to talk with Governor Glenn. And Attaculla and Aconostota were with this group. They were leading men of the Cherokees, and said, you know, we've got to work this out. We've got to work this out. What can we do? What can we do? And Governor Glenn says, you need to turn over 25 of your Cherokee warriors, and we're going to hang them. And the Cherokees were like, oh, this is terrible. Let us go back to our towns and we'll discuss what we're going to do. And Governor Glenn says, okay, you can do that, but the backcountry settlers of South Carolina are very mad at y'all. So I'm going to send a guard with you to protect you on the way back home. He sent several hundred men or something like that. And so they started going back to Cherokee territory, and when they got to the area of about Orangeburg, the guard surrounded, captured those Cherokee leading men and held them as hostage. And they marched these men from Charleston all the way up to Fort Prince George. Fort Prince George was built in 1754, and a sister fort, Fort Loudon in Tennessee. These forts were built to counteract French influence. Today, Fort Prince George in Keowee is at the bottom of Lake Keowee. These are very important sites. And the Cherokee leading men were taken to Fort Prince George, and they were put in a guardhouse there. The Cherokees raised a white flag, said that they wanted to talk to Lieutenant Courtmore, who was the commander of the fort. They met on the banks of the Keowee River. The town of Keowee is on one side, Fort Prince George is on the other. They met in the middle at the banks. Lord Courtmore came out, and as soon as he came out, Cherokee warriors rose from the stream bed and they shot and killed Lieutenant Courtmore. Well, from that point on, the war was on. This is the first Cherokee War, or the Anglo-Cherokee War. The hostages in the fort were immediately killed. This is Seneca. This is on the Clemson campus now. This is at the bottom of Lake Hartwell. This is the closest town to European settlement. Keowee, Tomasi here, we'll be talking about Tomasi, Estatoy here, Sugartown. They made a treaty in 1763, the Treaty of Charleston. In the Treaty of Charleston, this line here was defined, and it went from DeWitt's Corner southwest to the Savannah River, northeast to the Reedy River. Cherokee land was not defined earlier, and that was one of the reasons for conflicts. Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties were Cherokee land. It was illegal for any person of European descent to set foot in those lands without a passport. When the troubles with England began, the 96th district was divided in its allegiance to the Patriots or the Loyalists. The Council of Safety in Charleston sent a delegation through the 96th district. William Henry Drayton was regarded as a firebrand revolutionary, and a Baptist preacher and a Presbyterian preacher, Hart and Tennant, were sent along with Drayton as well. One of Drayton's selling points for joining the Patriot side was the extirpation of the Cherokees, and he preached this at every point. There was Battle of the Canebrake, in which the Loyalists were defeated. And the Loyalists in the backcountry, they had to either sign an oath of allegiance to the Patriot cause. If they didn't sign that, they would have half their property confiscated. If they were obnoxious about that, they'd have all their property confiscated. So the Loyalists either left and went down to Georgia or Florida. They went to ground and they just, tried to get along, or they went into Cherokee territory. And the Cherokees welcomed them with open arms, because the Cherokees were British supporters at this time, because Britain was promising that there would be no further European expansion. In 1776, the British had the idea that they were going to attack Charleston by sea, and they sent armada into Charleston Harbor on June the 28th, 1776. And this is the Battle of Sullivan's Island, where the defenders of Fort Moultrie just absolutely blew that armada to pieces. But at the same time that they wanted to attack Charleston, they wanted to establish a two-front campaign. So some people say, well, the British Indian agents fomented, the Cherokees going to warpath. Shawnees came down from Ohio and definitely tried to foment a Cherokee insurrection. And the Cherokees went on the warpath all along this border right here, which was defended by about 20 fortified homesteads that were forts. The Cherokees went on the warpath and they killed 61 settlers. The Hampton Massacre is perhaps the most well-known of that, when Wade Hampton's great-grandfather and 7 other members of his family were killed. This is Fort Lindley in Lawrence County. The actual fort was inside that tree line, and we can see the defensive trenches that were there at that fort, so we know exactly where the fort was. But you can't really see those trenches well. They're only like 2 feet wide and 1 foot deep now, whereas they were 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep. On July the 15th, 1776, 102 Tories dressed as Cherokees, Scofielites, and 88 Cherokees surrounded this fort at midnight, and a brisk 2-hour gunfight occurred. The defenders of the fort finally had enough of that. They threw open the gates of the fort and they charged out 10 abreast, and the Cherokees retreated. That was their method of warfare, was to attack, but if you got attacked in turn, they would retreat. The most important thing with these Cherokees was that fear of when that attack was going to come. This pretty scene right here is Lake Hartwell. At the bottom of this lake is the Cherokee town of Seneca. Seneca was the closest town to European settlement. Seneca was a staging ground for those attacks. Another staging ground for the attacks from the Cherokees was from Richard Paris's plantation right there in downtown Greenville. That's where those attackers left from to go attack Fort Lindley. Well, as Andrew Williamson was he was a colonel at the time, he gathered a force of 1,200 men to go through Cherokee territory. And as he did that, he came to the town of Seneca where he was ambushed. And you know, at the front of the column, it was just absolute chaos. Francis Salvador, the first Jewish American to be elected to public office in America, he was from Greenwood County. He became the first Jewish American to be killed in the Revolutionary War. Andrew Pickens was at the rear of the column. And he knew, because he was an experienced Indian fighter from the first Cherokee War, that if you attacked the Cherokees, they would retreat. That Battle of Seneca happened on August the 1st. And on August the 12th, Andrew Pickens is leading a force of 60 men to the town of Tomasi, which was abandoned. And they started burning the town down, destroying the cornfields. Robert Anderson was with Andrew Pickens. And Pickens sent Robert Anderson with 35 men off in a different direction. And Andrew Pickens and his 25 men continued raising Tomasi, when all of a sudden they saw a warrior jump up out of an abandoned agricultural field, somewhat like this. This may have been the exact site, or it may have been a place close by. That abandoned field had grass growing in it 3 feet tall. And Pickens turned to his men and says, "Hey, we got to go get that guy." So he takes his men and they charge after him. And when Pickens and his men are in the middle of this field, all of a sudden, 185 Cherokee warriors rise from the grass, and they have totally surrounded him. And what Andrew Pickens did was, he arranged 12 men in an inner circle and 13 men in an outer circle. And he had the outer circle firing while the inner circle was loading. And then the inner circle was fired while the outer ring was loaded. And for an hour and 15 minutes, he fought off those 185 warriors in that fashion. Now, 3 times the ring was breached, and it was hand-to-hand fighting with tomahawks and hunting knives. Andrew Pickens was in the thick of fight after fight after fight in the Revolutionary War. And he says that that hour and 15 minutes was the most intensive fighting of his entire career. Williamson and his force went through and they completely razed the 16 Cherokee towns that were in South Carolina. They were absolutely destroyed. 2,000 Cherokees were killed in the Cherokee War of 1776. That was the greatest massacre in the Revolutionary War, and it happened right in Pickens and Oconee County. And the Cherokees were driven into the mountains for that winter, and they were hardly a factor, for the rest of the war. Here is the thing about the role that the Cherokees had. A person decided whether they wanted to be a patriot or a loyalist dependent upon whether they thought William Henry Drayton's policy of extirpation was the way to go, or the British had the best policy towards placating the Cherokees. It was not a question of British oppression. The Rice Kings along the coast of South Carolina, they had issues with the British government, particularly in terms of free trade. But the backcountry of South Carolina, they were much more concerned about what the Cherokees were doing rather than what the British were doing, primarily down in Charleston. Now, it was British policies that dictated what was happening. From a governor appointed by a king who had never set foot in America. And the issue became, who is going to make the best decisions for our well-being? The king, the governor, or ourselves, determining what our fate was going to be. The first 5 years of the Revolutionary War is referred to as the American period. Now, once Charleston fell in May of 1780, that started the British period. Then, that's when the British were oppressive, and that's when we overthrew the British and their oppression. But the first 5 years of the war, it was primarily with the concern with the Cherokees more so than anything else.